I was just trying to return a casserole dish. That's all I was doing that Thursday afternoon. My neighbour Harriet had lent it to me 2 weeks before when I hosted my book club, and I had been meaning to bring it back ever since. It sat on my kitchen counter every single morning, reminding me. So when my son called to say he was stopping by with his girlfriend to pick up some of his old baseball cards from the garage, I figured I would ride along with them afterward and finally return that dish. Simple. Normal. The kind of small errand that fills a quiet retirement. I was 63 years old, living alone in the house in Baton Rouge where I had raised my children for 30 years. My husband Gerald had passed 4 years earlier from a sudden heart attack, prostate cancer they found almost by accident, and then a heart that simply gave out before the treatment could do much. I won't say I had fully recovered from losing him, because I'm not sure a person ever fully does, but I had found my footing again. I had my garden. I had my book club. I had my morning walks along the bayou. I had, I believed, a good life. My son's name is Daniel. He is 37 years old, tall like his father, with the same way of tilting his head when he's pretending to listen. His girlfriend, she had been around for 2 years by then, was a woman named Tara. 34, worked in pharmaceutical sales, always dressed like she was on her way to a meeting even when she wasn't. I had never disliked Tara exactly. I had just never fully trusted her either, and I could never explain why in a way that didn't sound like a jealous mother-in-law, so I kept it to myself. They picked me up at 2 in the afternoon. Daniel drove. I sat in the back seat with Harriet's casserole dish wrapped in a dish towel on my lap. We were about 6 minutes from Harriet's house when Daniel stopped at a red light and I noticed something in the front seat. Tara's handbag had slipped sideways between the seat and the door. Not an unusual thing, but the top of it was open and from my angle in the back seat I could see something I wasn't supposed to see. A phone. Not remarkable on its own. But this phone had a bright red case. Tara's phone was always in a rose gold case. She had shown me once, laughing about how she had to have the exact right shade. This red case was different. Cheap looking. The kind of case you buy because you need a case, not because you want one. I looked away. The light turned green. I told myself it was nothing. A work phone, maybe. Pharmaceutical reps sometimes carried 2 phones. I knew that. I had no reason to think anything at all, but something in the back of my mind, something I still cannot fully name, would not let it go. When Daniel pulled up to Harriet's house, I stayed in the car while he walked me to the door, and Tara waited in the passenger seat scrolling through her regular phone. I was only inside for 4 minutes. Harriet offered me sweet tea and I said I couldn't stay, handed over the casserole dish, and walked back to the car. As I slid into the back seat, I saw Tara had set her handbag on the floor. The red-cased phone had shifted. The screen was facing up now, and even from where I was, I could see that there was a text notification on the screen. I couldn't read it, but I saw a name. One word, a man's name. And it was not Daniel's name. I said nothing. I looked out the window. I watched the live oaks go past. That night I could not sleep. I lay in the bed that still felt too large without Gerald, and I stared at the ceiling, and I told myself, over and over, that I was an old woman reading too much into a phone case and a name on a screen I barely even saw. I told myself Tara had a right to her privacy. I told myself that whatever was in that phone was not my business. But I had been married for 34 years. I had watched my husband's face every day of those years. I knew what secrets looked like when they were being kept. I got up at 5:30 and made coffee and sat at the kitchen table. And I made a decision that I'm not entirely proud of, but that I know, even now, was the right one. I called Daniel and asked him if he had left his old winter jacket at my house. He had not, but I knew he would come by to check because that's the kind of man he is, thorough and a little anxious, always worried he's misplaced something. Sure enough, he said he'd stop by after work. I asked if he was bringing Tara. He said she had a client dinner. Good. When he arrived that evening, I made him stay for supper. Chicken and rice, his favorite since he was 9 years old. I asked him about work. He was an engineer at a water treatment facility, and he talked for a while about a new filtration project they were testing. I listened. I watched his face. He seemed tired, but not the tired of a man who is lying, more the tired of a man who doesn't know yet. After supper, I asked him, as casually as I could manage, how things were going with Tara. He smiled, said they had been talking about moving in together, said she had started looking at apartments near his place in Metairie. I smiled back and said that sounded lovely. After he left, I sat with my coffee going cold, and I thought about the look on his face when he talked about her. He loved her. Whatever was happening, my son did not know about it. And that was the moment I stopped being uncertain. That was the moment it stopped being about protecting my feelings and started being about protecting my child. I want to be clear about something. I am not a suspicious person by nature. I am not someone who looks for trouble. I spent 34 years in a faithful marriage and I raised two children and I taught third grade for 26 years. And I believe, fundamentally, in giving people the benefit of the doubt. But I also know the difference between suspicion and instinct. And what I felt that night was not suspicion. It was something older and quieter than that. It was the same thing I felt the morning Gerald said. His chest felt a little tight. And instead of letting him wave it off, I drove him to the emergency room myself. He made it another 2 years because of that morning. I have never forgotten what instinct feels like. 3 days later, I did something I am still not sure how to explain to people without them looking at me sideways. I drove to a little phone accessory shop on Magazine Street, and I bought a cheap phone case. Bright red, the exact shade I had seen in Tara's bag. I wasn't thinking clearly about what I would do with it. I think I just wanted to have it, like a piece of evidence that I hadn't imagined what I'd seen. The following Saturday, Tara came to pick up Daniel for a wedding they were attending, one of his co-workers. She came to the door while Daniel was still inside, getting ready, which meant for about 6 minutes she and I sat in my living room alone. She was pleasant. She asked about my garden. I asked about her work. She had set her handbag on the couch cushion beside her, and at one point she reached inside for her chapstick, and the handbag fell sideways. Both phones came out. She grabbed them fast, but not fast enough, and I saw her face in the half-second before she composed herself. And what I saw there was not embarrassment. It was calculation. She laughed and said, "Oh, she kept meaning to drop that old work phone off at the office, so the company had issued them new ones, and she still had the old one kicking around." I smiled. I said I completely understood. Daniel came downstairs and they left, and I stood at my front window and watched them drive away. And then I went to the kitchen table and I sat down and I allowed myself, for just a few minutes, to feel every terrible thing I was thinking. Then I got up and I started to think. I have a dear friend, a woman named Patricia, who I have known since our children were in kindergarten together. Patricia is 70 now, sharp as a tack, and her late husband was a retired district attorney. More importantly, Patricia had been through something similar 15 years ago when her own daughter-in-law turned out to be running up debt in her son's name. Patricia knew things, practical things. I called her that evening. I told her everything. She didn't interrupt me once, which is the mark of a person who is truly listening. When I finished, there was a brief silence, and then she said, "Irene, you need to know what's on that phone before you do anything else. Everything else depends on that." She was right. I knew she was right. I just didn't know how I was going to get access to a phone that wasn't mine. What happened next was not planned. I want to say that clearly. It was not a scheme. It was an accident that I chose not to correct. 2 weeks later, Daniel and Tara came for Sunday dinner. It was early November. The weather had finally turned cool, and I made a pot roast. The three of us sat at the table where my children had grown up, and I watched them together, and I watched Tara's hands and her eyes and the small, careful way she laughed at everything my son said. When they were getting ready to leave, Tara went to use the bathroom. Daniel went to start the car, and Tara's handbag sat on the counter by the door. I did not go through her bag. I want to be very clear about that. I would not have. But as I was carrying the leftover rolls to wrap up for them to take home, I bumped the edge of the counter with my elbow and the handbag tipped, and the red-cased phone slid out onto the floor. It landed face up, unlocked. The battery was at 11%. I stood there for 3 seconds, maybe 4. Then I picked it up, and I read. There was a thread of messages that went back 4 months, between Tara and a man whose contact name was listed only as R. I won't reproduce everything I read, but I will tell you what I understood in those 4 minutes before Tara came back down the hallway. She was not just seeing someone else. She was planning something. Something specific, something deliberate, involving my son's finances and my finances, and a timeline that made my hands go cold. She had told R that Daniel had a mother with a paid-off house in Baton Rouge, no mortgage, good savings, and that the son was the sole beneficiary of the will. She had told R that Daniel trusted her completely. She had said, and this is the part I had to read twice, that once they were married and she had access to Daniel's accounts, they could take what they needed and disappear before anyone connected the pieces. She was not planning to steal from Daniel. She was planning to use Daniel to steal from me. From my estate. From the life Gerald and I had built across 34 years. And she was going to marry my son to do it. Tara came around the corner. I set the phone on the counter next to the handbag where it had apparently slid. I handed her the rolls wrapped in foil. I walked them to the door. I hugged my son for 3 seconds longer than usual. I watched them drive away. Then I went inside and sat down on the bottom step of my staircase and pressed my hand over my heart and breathed. I did not cry. I was past crying. I was somewhere quieter than crying. The next morning I called Patricia again. She listened. She said 2 words. Call Stuart. Stuart Abernathy had been Gerald's attorney for 11 years and had handled our estate planning. He was 68, careful, and not the kind of man who overreacted to anything. I called his office when they opened at 8:30, and his assistant put me through when I said it was urgent. I told Stuart what I had seen. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, Irene, I want you to do nothing. Don't confront anyone. Don't change your behavior. Come see me Friday morning. I went Friday morning. Stuart had brought in a colleague, a woman named Miss Fontenot, who handled financial fraud cases. She was in her 50s, businesslike, and she asked me to tell her everything from the beginning, which I did. She asked careful questions. She took notes. At the end, she said, what you read constitutes evidence of intent to commit financial fraud, depending on what we can document. This could also involve wire fraud and conspiracy. She paused. The question now is how we protect your son and your assets without alerting her prematurely. I asked what she recommended. She said, we set the table, and we let her sit down. Over the next 3 weeks, Stuart updated my will, quietly, with Ms. Fontenot's guidance. He also helped me set up a trust structure that made my assets significantly harder to access through a spouse's indirect claim. These were legal moves, quiet ones, that changed what Tara would find if she ever got to where she was going. Then we waited. I want to talk about that waiting period because it was the hardest part. Harder than reading those messages. Harder even than deciding what to do, because during those 3 weeks, I had Sunday dinner with my son. I watched him talk about Tara with the open, uncomplicated love of a person who has no idea. I watched her sit across from me at my table and smile and ask if I needed help with the dishes. I said no. I dried the dishes myself. And I thought about Gerald, and about the table, and about what it meant to protect something that has been built slowly and carefully over a whole life. The last Sunday, before I did what I had planned to do, Daniel mentioned that Tara had suggested they get engaged at Christmas, that she had mentioned something about wanting a small wedding maybe in the spring. I nodded. I said that sounded beautiful. That night I called Patricia and I told her we couldn't wait any longer. The following Tuesday, I asked Daniel to come to lunch. Just the 2 of us, I said. I told him I'd been feeling nostalgic and just wanted some time with my son. He came because he is good and because he has never once, in 37 years, said no to lunch with his mother. We sat at a restaurant near Audubon Park. We ordered. And then I took a breath and I told him everything. I want to tell you that it went smoothly. It did not. He sat across from me for the first 3 minutes without saying a single word, and his face went through things I don't have language for. Then he said, Mom, do you hear what you're saying? I said, yes. He said, you're accusing the woman I love of, what, planning to rob you? I said, I'm telling you what I read. He said, on her private phone that fell, I said, that I happened to see. He pushed back from the table. He said he needed a minute. He walked to the window of the restaurant and stood there for a long time, and I watched his shoulders and the way he put one hand on the back of his neck, the exact way his father used to do. When he came back to the table, he sat down. He did not look at me. He said, what do you need me to do? That was everything. Those 6 words, the trust in them nearly broke me. I told him I needed him to give me 1 week. I told him not to change anything, not how he acted with Tara, not what he said, nothing. I told him Stuart had a plan and that Miss Para, Fontenot was involved and that it was being handled carefully. He asked if she was dangerous. I said I didn't believe she was violent. This seemed like a financial scheme, not anything more. He nodded slowly. He said, "What about R?" I said, "That's being looked into." The following Monday, Ms. Fontenot's contact at the Baton Rouge Police Department had been briefed. They had the screenshots I had taken of those messages. I had thought clearly enough that night to photograph the screen before I set the phone back down. Those screenshots, combined with the financial documents Stuart had pulled together, were enough to open an investigation. On a Wednesday afternoon, 2 weeks before Christmas, Tara was called into a meeting she believed was about a work matter. It wasn't. It was a conversation with two detectives and Ms. Fontenot. The man she had called R was a 38-year-old who had 2 prior charges in another state for financial fraud. They had found the connection through phone records. Tara did not go quietly. She called Daniel from the parking lot. She cried. She said I had set her up, that I was a jealous, controlling mother who had never wanted Daniel to be happy. She said I had violated her privacy. She said a great many things. Daniel did not say much in return. He told her the relationship was over. He told her he would not be speaking to her again. And then he hung up. He called me right after. He didn't say much to me either at first. Just, "Is it over?" I said. "The police are handling it." "Yes." There was a long silence. Then he said, "I'm sorry I doubted you for even a second." I told him not to be. I said I had raised him to think critically, and that doubting me for a minute was exactly the right response of a reasonable person. I told him any good son would have wanted more evidence before believing something like that about the woman he loved. He laughed a little, the way you laugh when crying is too close. He came over that evening. I made red beans and rice. We sat at the table and ate and didn't talk about Tara very much at all. We talked about Christmas, about whether his sister Nora would fly in from Denver this year, about whether the cold snap would hold through the weekend. Before he left, he stood in the doorway with his coat on, and he looked at me in a way that reminded me so much of Gerald. I had to look at the floor for a second. He said, "How did you know?" I said, "I didn't know. Not at first. I just didn't ignore what I was feeling." He nodded. He hugged me. He drove home. I stood at the window and watched his taillights disappear at the end of the street. Then I turned off the porch light and went inside to wash the dishes. Patricia called the next morning to check on me. I told her everything had come through. She said she was proud of me. I told her I was just tired. She said, "You protected your son." I thought about that for a while after I hung up. About what protecting someone actually means. It doesn't mean keeping them from more pain. Daniel was hurting, would go on hurting for a while, and there was nothing I could do to change that. Protecting someone, I think, means making sure the structure around them is solid even when everything else is falling apart. It means not looking away when you see something that doesn't add up, even when looking away would be easier. Gerald used to say that the most dangerous thing in the world was willful blindness. He meant it about politics, I think, but it applies just as well to a red phone case in a handbag on a Thursday afternoon. I think about that red case sometimes. Still, I think about how close I came to deciding it was nothing. How easy it would have been to decide I was an old woman being paranoid. How many times I almost let it go. Tara and R were both charged. The case is still working its way through the system, the way these things do. Slow and complicated and full of paperwork. Daniel took a few months that were hard. He dated no one. He worked. He came for Sunday dinner every week without being asked. By spring, he had started to come back to himself. He planted tomatoes in my garden, something he had done with his father years ago and hadn't done since Gerald died. We stood in the yard one Saturday morning in April with our coffee, watching the little plants in their rows, and neither of us said anything for a long time. Then he said, "They're going to need a lot of water." I said, "They always do." He smiled. It was Gerald's smile, right down to the corner of the eye. I thought about all the things I could have lost. The house, the savings, the trust I had built with my son over 37 years. I thought about the version of events where I had looked at that phone in the bag and decided it was none of my business. Then I drank my coffee and looked at my tomato plants and decided not to think about it anymore. Some things you protect, not by fighting loudly, but by paying attention, by trusting the quiet voice that says, "Look closer," even when you don't want to hear it. By not deciding, just because you're 63 and tired, and it would be so much easier, that what you're seeing can't possibly be what it looks like. It was exactly what it looked like, and I am so glad I did not look away. People ask me sometimes if I feel bad about reading those messages, if I feel like I crossed a line. I've thought about that question a lot, more than I expected to, and what I keep coming back to is this. The line I was worried about crossing was nothing compared to the one that had already been crossed without my knowledge. Tara had been sitting at my table eating food I cooked, asking about my garden for 2 years. She had looked at my house and my savings and my son, and she had made a calculation. She had decided that my life's work was something she could take, and she had been patient about it, which is somehow the part that stays with me longest. Patient. She was going to wait until there was a ring on her finger and my son's name on a joint account, and then she was going to take what she came for. What I have learned, really learned, not just understood in an abstract way, is that character doesn't announce itself. It reveals itself quietly over time, in the small choices a person makes when they think no one important is watching. Tara made her choices over months. In text messages she believed were private, with a man she thought I would never know existed. And those choices, made in private, became the thing that ended everything she had built toward. That's not luck. That's not chance. That's just the simple truth that what we do in the dark eventually has to hold up in the light. It always does. The structure of what we've actually built only becomes visible when something puts pressure on it. And what Tara had built could not hold a single afternoon's worth of pressure. Daniel is the other part of this that I think about. He doubted me for a minute and then he didn't. He sat across from me at that restaurant table, and even through his shock and his grief and his loyalty to the woman he loved, he chose to listen. That took something. That took the willingness to sit with a painful possibility instead of shutting it out because it was easier. I raised him to think, and in the hardest moment he had faced in years, he used that. I don't think I've ever been prouder of my son than I was in that restaurant, watching him walk to the window and stand there and let himself absorb what I had told him. That's what I mean when I say intelligence is not about being smart in the classroom. It's about being willing to look at something true and uncomfortable and not flinch away from it. Daniel could have flinched. He chose not to, and I almost flinched. I want to be honest about that. I saw that red phone case and I looked away. I told myself I was being paranoid. I spent a week talking myself out of my own instincts. What finally moved me wasn't courage exactly. It was just the refusal to keep being comfortable at the expense of being honest. There came a point where looking away felt worse than whatever I might find by looking closer. That, I think, is where real strength lives. Not in the dramatic moments, not in the confrontations, not in the lawyer's office or the police interview. It lives in the ordinary Tuesday when you decide that what you know matters more than what's convenient. I'm 63 years old. I have a garden and a book club and a son who comes for Sunday dinner. I have a house that Gerald and I built together over 34 years, and it is still standing, and it is still mine. That's enough. That's everything.